Today, we're going to unpack a wild legal thriller. It's a story where a major bank, a really complex financial scheme, and a massive pile of cash all collide with one tiny but absolutely fatal procedural mistake. Okay, let's get into it. So, at the very heart of our story is this number, just over 16 million pesos. That's the amount of money that seemed to vanish into thin air, then reappear, and ultimately it became the prize in a legal fight that went all the way to the top. And here is the central puzzle, the real kicker of this whole thing. The bank didn't just lose the money in the first place in what they claimed was a scheme. No, they lost again in court when they tried to get that money back. So how on earth does that happen? Well, let's find out. All right, so to really understand how it all went so wrong, we have to go back to the beginning. We need to understand the problem itself. And it all starts with a family, a bank employee, and a series of transactions that, let's just say, raised a lot of eyebrows. Okay, so let's meet the players in this drama. First, you've got the bank, East West Bank. Then there's Paul. He's their sales officer. We have a client named Ian. And finally, his father and brother, Francisco and Alvin, who also happen to bank at the same place. These are our four key players in what turned out to be a very, very messy situation. So how did this whole thing supposedly go down? Well, the bank alleged that their own employee, Paul, first took 16 million pesos out of the family's accounts and dropped it right into Ian's account. Then Ian immediately used that money to get a back-to-back loan, which he paid off almost instantly. And for the final act, the family turns around and demands that same 16 million back from the bank, waving around some contracts that the bank was convinced were totally fake. It's like a classic financial shell game. Now, when you're a bank facing a potential 16 million peso loss and what you believe is straight-up fraud, you don't just sit there. You fight back. And that's exactly what they did. They took this fight straight to court. So back in 2012, the bank files its lawsuit. And at first, things were looking pretty good for them. By 2013, they get a writ of preliminary attachment. Now, that's a big deal. It's a court order that basically freezes the other side's assets. It was a huge early win, and it really suggested the court thought the bank's case had legs. But then, the countermove, a motion to dismiss the whole thing. And this, right here, is where our story takes its first massive twist. Just when it looked like the bank had the upper hand, the judge slams the brakes, and the entire case gets thrown out of court. This is the million-dollar question. Well, the 16 million peso question, right? They had what looked like a clear-cut fraud scheme. They had a major early victory. So how could the case just disappear? Well, the answer wasn't in the facts of the case, but in two really fundamental legal rules. First up, something called cause of action. You can think of this like your legal ticket to even get inside the courthouse. You have to prove to the judge that you have a specific right and that that right was violated. The court looked at the bank's case and basically asked, wait a minute, whose money was actually taken from the accounts? And the answer? It was the family's money, not the bank's. And that leads us straight to the second key idea, the real party in interest. This rule asks a simple question. Who's the one who really stands to gain or lose here? The court decided that the people who were actually hurt were Francisco and Alvin, the ones whose accounts were debited. They were the real parties in interest, not the bank that was just holding their money. So let's be super clear on this. The trial court didn't say the fraud didn't happen, not at all. What they said was that the bank was the wrong plaintiff. It hadn't shown it was their injury, which made them the wrong party to be filing the lawsuit in the first place. The bank, convinced the court had it all wrong, decided to appeal. Of course they did. But the path they chose to take next, well, that would turn out to be the most expensive mistake of the entire saga. Okay, to understand this colossal error, we have to get our heads around a critical legal distinction: questions of fact versus questions of law. A question of fact is all about what happened. Did Paul actually move the money? It's about evidence. But a question of law is about how does the rule apply? For example, what's the legal definition of real party in interest? One is about what's true. The other is about what the law means. Now think about why the trial court dismissed the case. It had nothing to do with the evidence of the scheme. It was purely about interpreting legal rules. Cause of action, real party in interest. These were 100% pure questions of law. This brings us to the super strict roadmap for appeals in the legal system. It's basically a fork in the road. If your appeal is about questions of fact, you take one path. to the Court of Appeals. But if your appeal is based only on pure questions of law, you have to take the other path, directly to the Supreme Court. There's no other option. You have to pick the right road. And right here, this is the fatal error. The bank took their pure question of law dismissal and appealed it to the Court of Appeals, the court that handles questions of fact. They took the wrong procedural path, a simple but devastating mistake. And that one single misstep sent the whole case spiraling towards a final, irreversible end. The higher courts, at this point, they weren't even going to look at the 16 million pesos anymore. They were only going to look at the mistake the bank's lawyers had made. The rules on this are brutally clear. This quote from the rules of court says it all. If you take the wrong path on your appeal, they don't move it to the right court for you. No, it shall be dismissed outright. There are no do-overs, no second chances. It's just over. You can just see the dominoes fall here, one after another. The trial court dismisses the case on legal grounds. The Court of Appeals then dismisses the appeal because the bank filed it in the wrong place. And finally, the Supreme Court just looks at that and says, yep, they're right. It was a loss at every single level, all stemming from that one procedural error. And the ultimate consequence was just devastating for the bank. By the time their incorrect appeal was dismissed, the legal deadline to file the correct appeal with the Supreme Court was long gone. That meant the original dismissal by the trial court became final and permanent. The door on ever recovering that 16 million pesos was slammed shut, locked, and the key thrown away. So, what's the big takeaway from this whole mess? A multi-million peso case that just evaporated because of a technicality? It's this. In the world of law, how you do something can be just as important, if not more important, than what you're doing. You know, in its final decision, the Supreme Court left the bank with this little parting shot. They reminded them that banking is a business built on public trust and demands the highest degree of diligence. It's a subtle but pretty powerful critique of how this whole situation was handled from top to bottom. This whole case leaves us with a really fascinating and crucial question. When we're fighting for justice, we always focus on the merits, right? Who was right, who was wrong. But this story proves that sometimes the rules of how you play the game, they aren't just a technicality. They are the entire game itself.